think you should start drinking. You're weird.
I think you'd start drinking. Oh boy, something's gone real wrong if I have to
It's
start drinking.
it's Saturday, 12:30 in the afternoon,
They
Hey,
always say it's 5
you know,
o'clock somewhere, right?
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Bernd Wold, and I'm joined today by my co-host, James Erlinson.
Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
Oh, Roland, I am doing great. It is a relaxing, maybe finally quiet after a lot of busyness weekend. And listen, I could take this time off. I could relax myself and maybe go for a walk, maybe take in the sunlight, but instead I'm here recording an episode with you, my friend, and I couldn't be happier. How are you feeling today, Roland?
I'm a little bit nervous now because I see your poor life choices, hanging out
Ah,
with me here versus,
who
taking
needs
a walk. But
exercise?
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Well, the short update is, I don't know if anyone's interested in that. I lost my crutches. I put them away. So I'm hobbling around now without. So progress. Now I can have
Yeah.
a coffee cup and a coffee pot in the hands, That's another step up in quality of life.
But you have to go
Otherwise,
slowly. You can't actually run your way to the office.
oh,
Just
I have a new record. I have a new record, 100-meter dash in 3 minutes and 27 seconds.
hey, welcome to the new Olympics, my friend. People who've recently undergone a leg injury. I get it.
Yeah. Anyways,
Ah,
no. Otherwise, I'm good. There's some interest in the book, which I obviously like to see. I've been on a couple of podcasts. At least one of them is out by the time we publish this episode here. So things are going. Don't want to complain. All good. So,
no,
but
we do want to complain though, Roland, because today's episode is a big complaining episode. Welcome for
only
the
for
fun,
you.
folks. Oh yeah, well, listen,
For
I
you.
will complain.
Only
Trust
for
me,
you.
trust me.
You can complain. Yeah,
So,
I will be your psychology doctor. So,
aw.
sir, please lay down on the sofa. Let me take my
Well,
notepad
yeah.
and we'll see where we are.
I have some troubles that I'd like to let you know about, Roland. And today's episode is about the troubles with BPMN 2. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're calling this the BPMN 3 episode because really it's just a big complaint fest about what BPMN 2 has or doesn't have and why we think we need a BPMN 3. So, I wrote a little bit in an article that PEX Network is publishing, which is fantastic, about the need for an update to the spec. But I'm certainly not the first, and I certainly won't be the last. So we're going to include a bunch of things in the show notes, quick pitch for whatyyourbaseline.com, to tell you a little bit more about some thought leaders we've read and when we were doing some research for the show and combining it with our own experiences. But we've been using BPMN 2.0, Roland and I, for quite some time. I think I first came across BPMN as a concept in university, so in the late 2000s. But its usage, and particularly when I'm working with customers, my customers' usage, I find it lacking. I find the spec itself lacking, and I find a lot of problems with how it's had to be implemented in order to make up for those shortcomings. So, as I wrote in the article, let's make a BPMN 3. This is a call to action to the OMG to do something about it. And we've got some ideas today, Roland and I, on how you might want to change it, friends. And particularly whoever's working on this, or if anyone is working on this, give us a call. We love to contribute.
This will be a super weird episode, JM. You have the young buck who wants to change the world, and then you have the grumpy old man who says, "Nah, everything is fine." But
That's a normal dynamic, man. Don't worry about
yeah,
it.
yeah. Well, typically it's reversed, isn't it? But anyways, so let's talk a little bit before we jump into the details, because I think you could get lost in the details. Let's talk a little bit about what BPMN is actually, and
Yeah.
what is the motivation behind it. And let me start with that, with the promise of BPMN, because
Yes.
I think there's a couple of real benefits and a couple of really good ideas. and then we can bitch about if they were implemented correctly and all that other nonsense, But what I really, really like is the idea that BPMN, um, for better or worse, today is seen as the lingua franca of process design,
Hmm.
right? So if you go into a university, maybe except in Germany, uh, what do they teach students? They teach them BPMN, right?
Yeah.
And I say maybe besides Germany because I know there's a ton of organizations who use still notations like EPC or UML. Can you believe UML in the
Yeah.
forward? It's a process notation. What? So there's others out there, and I think the reason why people like BPMN so much is it had that promise of being a non-vendor driven standard, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the German-speaking countries, where EPC was the big thing, and everybody said, "Yeah, that's an Aries thing. That's not really open," which, by the way, is not true, right? So Dr. Scheer, pretty sure, will happily disagree with that. Um, but still, perception is what makes it, you know?
Well, and when I look at the development of BPMN, I look at the companies that signed on to the development of BPMN. I look at all the names, all those companies that came together. This is what you're looking for when you're trying to create a more global or universal standard. Is that no one vendor dictates its development. People who are experts who have often been hired by companies or started companies. I mean, Dr. Scheer is IDS Scheer, which became Eris. They all contribute their knowledge freely without advocating individually for their implementation of it, which I think is cool.
Yeah, but it's like in George Orwell's Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others.
Sure, the
So
promise was
the
that
the
though.
yeah, the BPMN standard, Stephen was pushing it very hard, from IBM. So there's people who are more involved and people who are involved to a lesser degree. But that shouldn't take away anything because I think that the main promise was twofold. On a technical side, and we will talk about that, obviously. On a technical side, it's like exchange of information, right? And by that, I
Yeah,
mean you model something, and it's executable, and it doesn't matter what execution engine you have behind, it should be able to run the underlying code. And on a personal side, it's the learn it once and you're good attitude.
yeah.
That's why you teach it to students, because it's transferable, the knowledge that you get.
Ideally, that was supposed to be like the last standard you'll ever need to learn for process modeling, or at least the last
Uh-huh.
standard family. And that kind of was the promise. I mean, BPMN one became BPMN two. There's things in the middle. We talk about that in a second. But the idea was that the standard would persist, and as a result, the learning you did was not invalid. It just it was incremental update rather than entirely new methodology. Um, that's part of why today's conversation is so important because that hasn't continued. So we'll
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about that. So when we take a look at this this as setting a model standard, um, I find this as a modeling standard really three purposes we talk about, which is how do I standardize the capture of information? So when people are putting things into some sort of visual format, so taking ideas from their head and putting on the page in more than just text. So creating visual indications of what they want the logic to be and how they want processes to work. You want to standardize that so that anyone explaining themselves is using the same language, right? That makes it clear and easy for someone to teach others how to use the language. Second thing is that it's supposed to standardize information publishing and the expectations for folks who are reading it. So it should be adaptable enough, or at least transportable enough that somebody who is reading it, who doesn't is not the one who created it, can understand it. And particularly, this is relevant. We'll talk a little bit this in the future about the complexity side of things. And I know Kevin Tan would have a lot to say about this, which is end users being able to actually consume this without not machines but human beings and execute against it with understanding fully what it entails. And lastly is of course what you said before, the standardizing a language by which you could interchange the ideas you have with the systems that will execute them. And I think it's an interesting sort of third part that they've done a pretty good job with, but we'll talk a little bit more about what they could do more with it.
You know what? I think you just fell into the trap of a misconception,
Please tell me.
because I think you gave your three reasons, right? Two of them
Yeah,
are more or less people oriented, and the
yeah,
one that you belittled a little bit is the automation part of it. I think uh, both are meant to be equal, even not the automation even higher, right? And you
right.
see that in characteristics of BPMN. For example, and they stated very, very clearly in my favorite chapter, 7.2, um, what the standard is not meant for. And
Yeah,
one of them is functional decomposition. It's a flat process. It starts and it ends. Yes, it has sub processes, but well, I almost had said we all know. I assume everybody knows. It's basically the sub process is basically just a collapsing of steps underneath. It's not a different level, which the word sub would suggest. It's the
hmm,
same level. It's just encapsulated. You collapse and expand, but it's on the same level. And this is what I've seen modeling tool vendors struggling with, right? Because
yeah,
when you come from the architecture side, like you and I come, right, you would expect hierarchies, right? You have different information on different levels, and I could show the pyramid picture again, um, and certain information on a certain level, and then on the lowest level you have the who does what when where, right?
yeah,
And that is basically the BPMN scope. So there's a delta, and I think
right,
we just need to be aware, and that's why I say misconception. We need to be aware that's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to execute processes, right?
right.
And
But
interesting
Roland,
enough,
why? Like but here's the thing. Like that's the question for me is why, right? Why would you choose to create a language by which people can communicate ideas, and say that it is explicitly for the purpose of communicating between humans and machines, or at least it's primarily purpose for communicating between humans and machines? I understand human to human communication is something we've done for a long time. Human to machine is something we've done for a much shorter time. So I suppose the onus is more important to focus on the thing we are less good at. But I would say in large and complex organizations, where I see a ton of failure occurring is between human and human communications, because the
yeah,
machines have a clearly definable, programmable, repeatable execution. And yes, you need to get it right, but it's not like every time you onboard a new person, you need to rewrite the code. Like that's like you need to get people to understand things.
take a step back and a couple of levels up, right? The fact that humans talk to each other, which has a value, don't get me wrong, right? Bringing everybody on the same page is awesome. But I think what you need to do is answering the question, why do you do process management at all? You do process management to improve the processes.
Yeah,
How do you improve processes? To a very large degree with automating processes to get
sure.
more throughput, faster times, fewer errors, whatever the reasons are that you have. So automation is a super critical point in that. So now you could say, oh, we have that human perspective and we have the machine perspective on it. And I don't even want to talk about AI yet, right?
I
And
do. We'll talk about it later.
we
But
will,
yeah,
we will talk. Promise, we will talk about this. Uh, but at the end of the day, I think you need to find a balance. And you and I should just be aware we come from that architectural perspective. That is not like people like Matusz, who we had in on the show a couple of weeks ago. Uh, they don't think that way. We had Bernd from Camunda on the show years ago. They don't think that way. For them, it's the pure utility of BPMN for execution purposes.
sure. Let's just talk about BPMN and where it came from for those
Mhm.
who aren't aware. Just I want to set these things out. We'll complain more later, folks. Trust me. But for now, let's talk BPMN, business process model and notation. Is a fairly old standard. Not as old as some others in the marketplace, or certainly not as old as flowcharting as a concept. But the BPMN standard itself, right, is 2000 is I think the first we looked at sort of the history here. First born in 2001 as an idea, by the Business Process Management Institute. And eventually, with a bunch of collaborators, came together for BPMN 1.0 in May of 2004, which was the whole stated purpose of it was just like sort of easy to understand the last notation you'll need, a more global standard that you could use, and mapping it to the executable markup language, so XML, for interchange, and for, or at least for the ability to execute the processes that are designed out. And it had BPMN 1.0 was there for a long time. And yet there was a lot more that needed to happen. So the idea is mapping it to more of an execution language, increasing the symbology, creating better semantics. And there was a bunch of updates and changes that needed to be done on top of the first version of it. So of course, they built a second one. And in January of 2011, BPMN 2.0 came out with other types of models, like there were different choreography and conversation diagrams and different execution semantics, different like interchange formats like the .bpmn XML schema definition. And that those are really good for the purpose of interchange with tools that were able to accept it. So there's a lot more elements that were introduced in here. And BPMN 2.0 from 2011 was considered as an important thing to keep fresh and update. And by 2013, December 2013, they'd made BPMN 2.0.2. And at that point in time, I guess everyone said we're good, because that's the last time we see an update on the Object Management Group or the OMG's website. So from 2001 to 2013, there was a lot of work to define this standard, and we still teach it 12 years later. So 12 years later, from the last update, we still teach this. And to me, that tells me that we liked what we had, but that there's been not enough political will or not enough organizational drive or not enough pressure from organizations who leverage the standard for the centralized body to update it. And I think that's a thing we need to talk about today, and talk about why that might be happening, and talk about how we can push for that to happen.
So I think there's two things. The first one was actually even further back, and I will put a graphic in the show notes,
Yeah.
about the timeline, because before the Business Process Management Initiative started, right, that conglomerate of firms, there was another standard called XPDL. Right? I
Yeah.
don't know if and people and all those others, right? So there was a cacophony of different execution standards. So the idea was to say, okay, can we standardize the standard into that exchange format, the .bpmn? And
Yeah.
that also, just to make it clear, existed in BPMN 1.0 as well, right?
Yeah.
So BPMN 1.0 was executable. I think the biggest shift that we've seen when BPMN 2 came out is addressing some shortcomings, where they went and split, for example, the BPMN process into two, right? The collaboration and the process that
Process.
meant for sub processes, whatever, right? And they added two more model types, the conversation, where you would summarize the exchange of data and so on and so forth, which, to be quite honest, I've never seen in real life.
No.
I played with it, but it's like, okay, no. People they love their swim lanes, so they use the collaboration, and then they misuse the collaboration again for sub processes, and it's inconsistent and whatever, right? So I think, in summary, and I agree with you, there hasn't been a lot of things since 2014. There's a bunch of articles as early as 2016 who said, oh, we need to do something, but it never resonated. The other thing that I think we've seen is vendors saw shortcomings
Yes.
and they did their own things.
Mhm.
So to give you an example, both of us worked for SAF AG, with Eris as the tool.
They literally rewrote it. They created a new model type based off of BPMN, and they kept it compliant-ish.
Because they have been burnt before with other standards where they extended it to the full Eris model. So they said, no, you get it by the book, right? So you have a couple of model types that are by the book with the shortcomings, like lanes are empty containers that could be anything, right? So what they did is, rightfully so, because every other company did that as well. I'm looking at you, Mega and BizAgile and whatnot, all those
Yeah.
others, they did their extensions, but they never got the flag for it, Either way, I think those are all good, right? So I think that there is a consensus that the BPMN standard, to be usable for business analysts, and I'm not talking about implementers, I'm talking analysts, need to be extended.
Yes.
And they did that. Did they do it the same way? Yes, to a certain degree. I think that would qualify for some standardization.
I would agree. And I think
Yep.
that the part here that really bothers me is that with the promise of BPMN as a concept, and I do think that the promise is primarily focused towards automation. I agree that's like specifically called out in 7.2, like we don't include process decomposition, strategy, organization data, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
The that's To me, that's kind of a cop out, because what you're saying is that the rest of the elements of a business that need to be captured adjacent to or even within a process itself are out of scope, so you can just make it up yourself. So we are a standard to a point, and then after that point, which is something that every company experiences, that standard, who cares? Make up your own.
That I think that's per se, I think it's fair. You say, hey,
It's fair, but I don't think it's
these are
good.
the guardrails in which I interact. So to
Right.
give you an example, OMG, the owner of the standard nowadays,
Mhm.
they own additional standards. One of them is DMN. Remember our conversation that we had with Tony the other
Yep.
day. And it is, quote unquote, integrated with BPMN, because in BPMN you have the business rule task, and that allows you to invoke the decision
Yeah.
models that you have. That's perfect, right? What they didn't do is they didn't build the same connectivity, and I'm talking conceptually, not
Yeah.
technically,
Yeah. Yeah.
the same connectivity for all those other things, right? When I think about lanes and connect lanes to org charts, or when I think about data, which one of the assumptions in BPMN is that data is freely available during the execution of the process, but it does not include persistent storage for forever, despite using a little database
Data
ton
store
icon, you
icon.
know.
Yeah.
Yes,
But
but they
the
could
point
have
I'm trying to
done
make
that.
here, Roland, is more specifically that the promise of BPM should include those sorts of things. I believe that the border that is set by the OMG in the BPMN 2.0.2 spec is too restrictive, because it should incorporate more to allow a standard to be something that everyone can embrace, with process related elements that
Mhm.
are simply a necessity to describe this to more than machines, and maybe even to machines.
Okay, JM, pour your heart out. I'm
Yes,
grabbing
please.
my notepad and all that stuff. Talk more about it, about the things that you see as shortcomings in the current version.
But we'll talk about this in the second section, about like sort of what we want to actually see in BPMN 3.0. But let's start with this. First and foremost is that models and levels are kind of a mess. The way in
Mhm.
which you structure information, there's like a good example is APQC. They've really thought about models and levels. That's a really interesting thing. The way that BPMN lays it out is not. I don't think it's sufficient. I
You
don't think it's
got
well
one,
defined.
JM. You got one. Nothing
Yeah.
more. One. No
One
functional
model that
decomposition. You got
no, no, no,
one.
no, no. Like we don't have the idea of conceptual, logical, physical in models for processes. We just have like business process, like collaboration, and then like process, and then conversation. And I think that the boundaries there are not well defined.
Same level. Flat. Flat.
Well, I would like to see
Flat.
multiple levels available. I'd like to see an overall process, like a value chain level. I'd like to see process models. I'd just like to see task models. I would also like to be more clear, or at least more implemented, with the idea of public processes versus private non-executable versus private executable. Like, though that seems like a weird definition that no one ever talks about, but it's in the spec and that's not reflected in the code that comes from it. That there's a lot of things about it. So models and levels, I would like to see fixed.
And by the way, just to chime in, I agree. You remember Matos, you and I looked at a one of his project examples where he had a customer that did a lot of low code, no code development without a strong governance behind it. So everybody did whatever, and Matos did a little analysis how those low code, no code workflows are dependent on each other, and he got a big spaghetti diagram.
Oh yeah,
Where
terrible.
I'd wholeheartedly agree with him. Like, yeah, you might want to start from scratch and set it up in a proper way. And that is the
Yes.
use case where hierarchies and nice little drawers where you put your things, comes in handy. I agree with that. But it's not
Yeah.
currently in the spec because they set some borders.
Absolutely, and the board. But one second, that border needs to be broken down for sure. I would love to be able to officially and for the purpose of documenting and executing the process by both people and also systems, include process adjacent domain objects, things, and we'll talk about this specific, but like as you mentioned before, like organizational elements being the lanes you see. Why is that not the
Mhm.
case? And there's a whole whack of them that once again, almost every vendor is doing this themselves, but they're all doing it a little differently, which completely breaks the idea of having a standard for business process modeling. So all the adjacent objects, I'd like to be able to bring that in. And
Mhm.
adjunct to that, we'll talk a little bit. One of a friend of the show slash somebody we have a lot of respect for, Pedro Robledo, wrote a really interesting article about AI, and so why there are certain things as part of the spec that just don't work well for AI. So autonomous decision making, like the traditional gateways are predefined rules, and versus the probabilistic models of agency, adaptive interactions, dynamic execution, like these sorts of things. So being able to better capture that in BPMN 3, we would need something like that.
We will talk about it. I disagree. And that's a misconception of the
I
act of
it's my
gateway.
wish list. My wish list.
Yeah, yeah, I
The
know, I
next
know, I know,
the,
I
the
know.
next thing is that besides the models and the objects, of course, the next thing is connections. We need we need more and better connections to describe the relationships between the additional objects we've brought into the models. It can't just be message and sequence flow. Obviously, there's going to have to be other things that come that we'll talk about, and like the kinds of relationships I'd like to see as part of the spec and part of a clearly defined spec for that. Because once again, consulting companies do this. When they come in and tell you how you should be able to interact between your people and your processes, they have a standard, but they all have sometimes little different standards, and why is not incorporated into a language. And then just more conversation around the interchange language itself, and then the transportability between platforms, the transportability between so modeling platforms, and the transportability between modeling platforms and execution platforms, particularly in the world where we're looking at more and more platforms that don't use this sort of code to generate processes, like low code or no code tools or vibe coding tools or AI agents. So using a more adaptable interchange language that can be sort of respected by those external platforms, so you can more clearly implement what you've designed with the least number of sort of translation steps in the end tool.
Well, but those tools might or might not use BPMN.
Right,
And
but
and
you want to make it so they could.
well, I don't know. So I'm thinking out loud. We had Maximilian from Tim on the show,
You did.
and
Great guy.
they actually take a BPMN diagram and put it in their low code no code tool, and you can do things and you can trace it and you see where the process instance is in a diagram and all that stuff. While I was looking at the other side, and you had a conversation the other day in a webinar about AI automation using N8N, and all those other fancy tools. There's no BPMN process. None. You just do whatever you want. There is no BPMN process in workflow configuration in ERP systems, right? So I think we need to distinguish between execution engines that follow and execution engines where you use the standard to document what has happened, but there's no technical connectivity.
When I see like ERP systems, like I'm thinking about like the old Software AG Designer, Oracle Business Process Modeler, SAP, their business process modelers. They all use BPMN. Like those aren't, or at least they use something akin to BPMN. So even those tools have historically used BPMN to capture what was being executed automatically within the ERP. So that's that's
Not in the way that Bernd would approve. The process
not
orchestration.
necessarily fair and
Yeah.
fair and fair. So in our second section, we're going to go into like the specifics of what we want to change. But hopefully after this, you've understood a little bit more of our grievances with BPMN 2.0. So the question is to you, our audience. Have you used BPMN 2.0? If you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you know a little bit about it. Maybe it's a false assumption. Welcome to the whole like BPMN world, friends. But have you used it? What shortcomings have you found with it? And how have you worked around or overcome those shortcomings to effectively communicate with your stakeholders and with your systems? We'll come back with our second section and tell you the details on everything we'd like to see in BPMN 3.
And by we, you obviously use the royal we.
The we. Hey folks, JM here. We had so much fun recording this episode about BPMN 3. We decided to split it into 2 parts. So what you're going to see next is the outro, but don't worry, we'll come back next week with part 2 of BPMN 3. Once again, thank you for coming along on this ride with us. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. We certainly have. And I'm excited to hear all of your thoughts about what would make the best BPMN 3.0 for you. And until then, I've been J.M. Merlinson.
And my name is Roland Wood.
And we will see you in the next one.